Welcome back to another episode of Christian Reflections. I'm Jared Beebe, and our goal is to reflect deeply and to reflect Christianly. So, as we begin this episode, our topic's going to be about the Evangelical Church, and I briefly talked about it in the introduction video, the state of the church in America, and we see a rapid decline, even in cultural Christianity, but a lot of that has stemmed from rapid growth in the seeker-sensitive church movement and the megachurch movement, and now we're seeing a lot of children that are now adults that grew up in that are now uh, completely abandoning the faith or moving to more liturgical Christian practices and denominations. So the reality is the church now is, we see the downfall of a faith that has roots in large evangelicalism, a faith that is not well reasoned, it's not intellectual. If you study the early church fathers and their apologetic to a pagan culture, a lot of the pagans would push back and say, you Christians lack education, you lack the smarts. But the early Christians still used intellectualism to form a robust apologetic to the naysayers against the Christian faith. If you read Justin Martyr and his responses, or Tertullian, or Origen, a lot of the early church fathers were not shy in being intellectual as an apologetic to combat paganism or the Jewish faith or whatever the challenges that were coming at them. But you fast forward to today, and the American church is anti-educational, anti-intellectual. Many churches frown upon academics. And a lot of that stems, I would argue, from the Second Great Awakening in American history. You had Christians during that movement leaving traditional, concrete faith practices and moving from the scriptures to make arguments to feelings, something within, God spoke to me type language. And as that crept into the early 1900s in America, you started seeing a rapid split between modernists and fundamentalists. And a lot of the modernists during that age were products of the Second Great Awakening, whether their parents were a part of that movement, and then they spread from that. But you get, fast forwarding to today, an anti-intellectual bent towards Christianity. And that's where the church is at now. And today's episode is going to be talking about the importance of studying church history and studying historical theology and systematic theology. So it's a big importance for me that churches and individual Christians would study doctrine, would study history of denominations, would study creeds and confessions. Not to say that all of those things are perfect in themselves, but in order to grow as a Christian and as evangelicalism as a whole, churches need to stress those things. Let's study theology and doctrine, and not just the views that you agree with full-heartedly, Stretch yourself and challenge yourself. And that's the only way you can grow in your own convictions, if you're reading viewpoints that don't agree with you. So study movements, study denominations that you disagree with. Study broadly evangelicalism, right? Let's study Lutheranism, study Anglicanism, study Presbyterianism, study Catholicism, study the Methodist movement, the Baptist movement. Study all of these things to help sharpen where you land on the faithfulness of what God's Word is teaching. No one has their theology perfect, and it's sad when I see social media posts and comments. Everyone online is an expert. But the reality is they're not. They don't have the degrees to back it up. They don't have the studying. They've watched a YouTube video, now they're an expert. But I'm challenging you to study the history of the Lutheran tradition, the Anglican tradition, all these faith movements in Christianity. Study them and see where they're coming from on specific exegetical and scriptural issues, and it will strengthen you. Also, on that same subject, study creeds and confessionals throughout the thousands of years of church history. Study those things. Evangelicals now don't study any of those things. They're comfortable with going to church on Sunday, checking it off the box if they go, checking it off the box, and that's it. It's let me go to church, and how can the church help me with my needs? Well, that's not how traditionally the church looked at worshiping the Lord on the Lord's Day. Sermons don't challenge people anymore. Sermons are a couple TED Talk points that leave people in the audience feeling joyous and happy and not convicted of sin or how they've sinned against a perfect and all righteous God or sinned against others. So we need to study church history. We need to study historical theology and the history of movements and doctrines and denominations. History, the study of history, is never black and white. Never. Nothing in life is black and white. Very few things. But especially studying church history, it's very complicated. So when you see people online making comments about one tradition against another, the reality is a lot of times those are straw man arguments, and the issue is much more complicated than that. And history always has a context. There's a contextual basis to the forming of denominations, or even in the early church. The early church was challenged with certain challenges from outside pagan or unbelieving pseudo-Christian groups. And those type of things strengthen the church to formulate, hey, what does the Bible teach? And that's how we get creeds and confessions and denominations. So the context is strengthening the church when it is properly abiding to God's word for the answers and not to subjectivism, personal experience, any of those type of things. So the context is key. The social setting leads to doctrinal growth, especially in the early church. They didn't handle every issue, but they handled very key issues that were challenged to them early on. Trinitarianism, Christology, things like that. Fast forward to 2025, and evangelical churches broadly, many members in those churches, if they even hold to membership, have very, very false views that were established early on in the church's history of Jesus or the hypostatic union or Mary or the triune God. They don't know their Bibles, and they don't know the history of the church. So we need churches to become interested in the deep things of God. And I think that starts organically, church by church, local church by local church. But I hope that Christians would reflect deeply inside and say, why do we, whatever denomination you're in, why do we believe this on whatever topic? Why? It seems like many evangelicals don't ask those questions. And they don't think for themselves. And they're not reflecting on things that should encourage them. If God has saved you, why would you not want to study the Bible more? Why would you not want to study church history and theology? There's a couple books I have here that talk about some of the things that are being discussed. And this is an older book. I think it has a newer cover now, but it's one of my favorite historians. It's Mark Knoll, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And this was written in 1994. And this book is challenging evangelicalism broadly. And this was written in the 90s. Fast forward to today, and the state of the church is even worse. A anti-intellectualism that largely stems from the Second Great Awakening and then all these movements that happened throughout the history of the church in the 90s. I read this book recently, and this is another book that was written in the 90s, I think 93. This book is amazing. It's so prophetic in a way for even today's church. But it's David Wells' book, No Place for Truth, or Whatever Happened to Evangelical Theology. And it talks about some of these issues I'm talking about now in the state of evangelicalism. And we shouldn't be surprised now why so many kids that are now adults, that were kids during these like the era of the 90s and the 2000s, why they're not Christians at all, or they've deconstructed to the point where they're believing in something that's not Christian at all, or they've left to more liturgical practices. So we need to study the deep things of God in our local churches. Yeah, do it outside the church as well, but we need Sunday schools and Wednesday night classes and things like that are on church history and systematic theology and historical theology. And that's my desire, to see more evangelical churches do those things. And a lot of it is Bible churches and non-denominational churches that don't hold to anything that is liturgical in the sense that it has roots, and that's why so many people are disillusioned by it. But the Protestant faith is a movement that is a renewal movement, and we need a renewal now in the church in 2025. We need to get back to studying our ancient roots. And another thing I'll say is we need to be humble when doing this, to admit that you do not have it figured out. I don't have it figured out. I will never have it figured out, even till my deathbed. And the same will be said for you. I have my convictions and I've studied many things, but that does not mean to say that I have it perfectly figured out. And sadly, again, so many people, when I see YouTube comments or Facebook comments on Christian topics or doctrines attacking different groups, they come off as experts, and they're not. And sadly, they're not humble. And that type of posture, even if they are correct, is not going to win someone maybe who's reading comments or watching something on YouTube. It's not going to lead someone to Christ. And that's the goal of this channel, is to reflect deeply, reflect Christianly, um, to show that history is fun and it's engaging and it applies uh, even to the church in 2025. As Protestants, the scriptures are crucially important, but the principle of sola scriptura means that the Bible is perfect and is our infallible rule for faith and practice. But it does not negate additional helps, meaning sources of confessions and creeds and books and history. The point is that the scriptures are the main source to combat whether those other sources of history or creeds are accurate, are faithful according to the Bible. So yes, we hold the sola scriptura, but in broad evangelicalism, we need to study our history and our historical theology badly. So I will end with two sources that are helpful. This is another book by Mark Knoll. It's called The Work We Have to Do, A History of Protestants in America. This is a helpful book off of the Scandal book, and just showing, especially First and Great Awakenings, but how Protestants have affected America, positive and negative ways, which shapes where we're at today in 2025. And I didn't plan this, but there's two Mark Knoll books and there's two David Wells books. This book, I do not have the dust cover, but it's The Courage to Be Protestant by David Wells. This came out in 2008, and it's making an argument for more concrete theological, intellectual, academic training that needs to be had in Protestant churches, and that we shouldn't be embarrassed to be Protestant. I know many people are converting to Eastern Orthodoxy and to Roman Catholicism, but we have rich roots, and I would argue that Protestants do reflect, especially the teachings of the early church fathers. Not perfectly, but either does the Catholic Church. So, we need to strengthen our evangelical churches, and the argument in this video is through the studying of the history of the church, the studying of doctrine, the studying of denominations and creeds and confessions. Not that they are all correct, but there are truths in lots of works and lots of confessions, even if we don't hold to everything in them. And we need to study why we believe what we believe as Protestants and evangelicals. So I'm going to end this video here. My name's Jared Beebe, and let's reflect deeply and let's reflect Christianly. Bye.